Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Soberful podcast. I am joined today by Dr. Fred Luskin and Lynden Harris. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. Good to be with
you.
So, the reason that I wanted to get these two lovely chaps on is they have written a book called the Forgive for Good Recovery Workbook. And it's a book about forgiveness, and particularly for people with a substance use disorder. First of all, how did you meet?
Gosh, we met right after 9/11 through a mutual friend, Rod Beckstrom. I had gone through, I did a lot of work after 9/11 at Ground Zero in New York, and my life fell apart. And Rod told me, he said, well, I think you need to forgive these guys. And I said, what? I was livid. He said, well, I got a guy I want to introduce you to. So Fred and I met, and we actually did a workshop together. Fred led it, of course, for 9/11 family members who had lost loved ones on the day. And remember that, Fred? We were in New York at your friend's house, who is the Grammy Award-winning musical producer. I can't remember the names, but that was a long time ago.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
I have taught forgiveness as part of the Stanford Forgiveness Project since the late 90s. The person Lynden was referring to was a very successful Silicon Valley something who had made a fortune of money selling his whatever, and then became very interested in how do you make the world a better place. So he and I connected, and he told me about Lynden, who had done humanitarian work with the people who were the first responders and stuff at 9/11. When I met Lynden, he was, let's say, not yet in recovery from resentment.
That took a long time.
Well, I mean, I kind of almost want to spend the whole podcast talking about that, because that's no small thing, is it? Being involved in the aftermath of 9/11 and the impact that had on so many people.
You know what I discovered, though, is that my story was really kind of the story of every man and every woman who got a big no from life. We talk about forgiveness as making peace with no. You get that thing you didn't want to get, or you didn't get the thing you wanted. And forgiveness is finding a way to make peace with that and move forward. It's not forgive and forget. It's forgive and remember differently, and see a wider perspective on life more objectively than subjectively. So, I felt I got a raw deal from folks I worked for, and my resentments were at least as bad for me as the trauma of 9/11. Now, putting both of them together was a toxic mix that took me, more than a decade to work through. But forgiveness is really what brought me through. And our mutual friend Rod used to send me boxes of Fred's book, his best-selling book, Forgive for Good, to hand out to the folks I was seeing in pastoral counseling. That was, sooner or later it was going to take root in my life. I was talking the talk, but it took me a long time really to walk the walk. And I think maybe that's my best credential for doing this work now, is I saw and I feel the difference it made in my life. And now I'm a zealot. I tell folks when I'm doing my recovery classes, I spent a lot of time in resentment, and I don't want you to waste another drop of your precious life doing what I did. If you're working on a resentment, you are working against your sobriety. Cannot be more clear than that.
You are singing my song. This is the hill that I will die on. This is it.
It's an important one.
Why is resentment so bad? Fred and then Lynden?
It distracts you from what's actually going on in life, because you're fighting like the last war and not what's actually happening in your life. It dysregulates the heck out of your nervous system, your brain function. So you end up like revisiting old wars with bad solutions.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't work. But we have the need, this pressing need to make sense out of life, to protect ourselves. And so the pain and suffering of not fulfilling that need and of actually making it worse with people who are vulnerable or whose nervous systems are not well regulated. It intensifies distress. It would intensify craving. And again, it doesn't work. And so there's this existential horror of, this terrible thing happened. I don't like it. I'm starting to get bitchy. It's not getting better, and I don't know what the heck to do.
Lynden, why is resentment so bad?
Well, I'll tell you personally, to the hammer, everything's a nail.
Hmm.
And you can't be successful in life if you're going around with a hammer trying to beat things up. There's such a limited bandwidth of your emotional and intellectual creativity. I'll never forget, one of the turning points for me was when Fred told me, he said, well, Lynden, I get that you're angry. I get that you're miserable. But I think if you only spend 50% of your time thinking about how badly your life sucks, and then the other 50% of the time looking for blessings, you might be a happier person. And that became an invitation to me to see life in a bigger bandwidth and more than my resentments. But the resentments can just consume you. You're so limited if you're only working against resentments in your life. And I had to find that out the hard way. I realized, there's this quotation we use a lot by a guy named Lou Smedes. He says that forgiveness is setting a prisoner free and realizing after the fact that the prisoner was you. And until I realized what the resentments were doing to me in my life, I was in prison. And Nelson Mandela, said that not to forgive or nursing a grievance is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die from it. Well, I drank a lot of that poison, and I'll be honest with you, it tasted really good. Because I was playing Ain't It Awful, that old game. But every time I took a sip, a part of me died. And that's what resentments do to you. It's not the full picture.
There's one other thing that is not as often highlighted. And when we have resentments, when any of us have resentments, it gives us an excuse to make bad decisions and do stupid things. So, if you walk through life thinking like your parents ripped you off or your ex-partner was an idiot, then it's a rationale and a placeholder so there's a good reason why I'm making this idiotic life decision, or I'm destroying this relationship, or I'm stealing this, that, and the other thing. I'm going to say it's the human race's built-in excuse to do bad things.
You could not have put it more perfectly. I always describe resentments as the free drunk. Because what people with an alcohol problem want to do is we want to drink and we want it to not be my fault.
Right.
I want it to be the story that I want it to be the thing. That's like, this happened to you, you drink too, which is like, it just was nothing to do with me.
It's always someone else's fault.
Yes. Yeah. Fred, I want to ask you, this will make perfect sense to everyone intellectually, but why is it so hard to forgive?
There's multiple reasons. Often people grow up in homes where it's not modeled, where they don't see it in action. So that's a good segment of the population. Almost all of us live in cultures that have grievances and resentments towards other people, other cultures. Right now in the United States, we live in a normal where red states don't trust blue states.
Yeah.
And you almost can't make a statement without one side or another saying, that's fake news. Or so there's resentment and hostility just right at the surface. So there's a lack of social modeling and a really strong preference for more hostile-based solutions. But the inner mechanism is, and you've probably heard this, the human nervous system has an enormous negativity bias. And so we are basically structurally wired to be anxious as a kind of default. to spend a lot of our time worrying about the future. Will this work? Will that work? We rarely have a mindset of equanimity or even hopefulness. And so when you put that relentless attention on what's wrong, it feels very uncomfortable to release that.
I had a thought about that too. One of the things Fred said early on in getting to know him was that sometimes it's hard for us to let go of our resentments because it's hard to forgive because we're loyal to our suffering.
I'm writing so many notes here. I'm like, oh my God, loyal to our suffering. Say more about that.
If we think that by forgiving someone, we're letting them off the hook, then that's not good. What's so important for us to say with regard to our work with people in recovery is to be clear about what our definition of forgiveness is. It's not letting someone off the hook. It's not saying that what happened to you didn't matter.
Yes.
It's not saying we give up having feelings. It's not even reconciliation, in our definition of forgiveness that Fred's worked out over 20 years. It's about setting ourselves free. It's something we do for ourselves. It's a trainable life skill. And it could be said it almost has nothing to do with the other person. Now, we also see this as an adjunct to the 12 steps, and we take seriously the serious moral inventory that's a part of that and making amends. We don't want to say that's not important, but deep down, forgiveness is something we do for ourselves. And, why should we, because someone treated us poorly at one point in our lives, why should we continue to litigate that battle for another 20 years and be miserable? Why do we hold on to it? Well, we're loyal to our suffering. We don't understand that we can let it go and still say it wasn't good that it happened, but we can change the channel. One of our exercises in the workbook is called Change the Channel. We can literally change the channel from I had the worst mother in the history of the human race to wow, look out there at the marsh, isn't it beautiful? We make decisions, and realizing that we have decisions to make helps us forgive. If we only think that forgiveness is our inability to forgive has to do with our loyalty to our suffering, then it's a no-win. But forgiveness is bigger than that, and it's not saying that what happened didn't matter.
I'm going to tell you a very short, but not interesting, but how we stumbled a little bit on what Lynden just said. Decades ago, we brought women from Northern Ireland who had had their sons murdered to Stanford, and we started by them telling us their stories of, these horrible situations, being pulled out of taxis, being buried in mass graves. I mean, just horrifying. And then we got the idea, well, this is not going to do well. Like it's one horrible pity party story after another. We made the decision to, well, let's bring them to the window of, this was on the 5th floor of a building on Stanford's campus. And we pulled the blinds up, and it was like January, but it was sunny in California. They had come from gray, dark Belfast. We opened the window. We said, feel the sun. Just feel the sun. Have its rays warm you. And recognize that right this second, life's okay. Right this second. And the sun, like the goodness, is always available. And that was the first deep practice moment of, no matter how bad the wounding is, there are possible moments of freedom from it, and that we were looking at extending those moments of freedom rather than just allowing them to tell us why they're stuck. That was the deep original decision that we understood we were doing with forgiveness. You're not here to tell us why you're stuck. We're here to explore moments where you're free and then help you reframe, need more moments of freedom.
Yeah, and like your approach to sobriety being a process, we also say forgiveness is a process. It's not once and for all. What we offer is a suite of tools to help people regulate themselves emotionally and to find strategies to build on some positive, constructive possibilities for their life.
Can you talk about those tools? Because I'm thinking, like, I mean, I grew up in the UK, so and I grew up during. I mean, I wasn't in Ireland, but I mean, that's, you know, we were very aware. I don't think I ever went on the tube, the London Underground, in the like 80s or early 90s without there being a bomb scare and having to leave. And I remember actually, my husband was in Cambridge doing his PhD, and we'd go down to London, and he would be like, "There's no trash cans. Like, where are the trash cans?" I'm like, "Oh, we don't have trash cans because of the bomb scare."
Bombs. Yeah.
And I just can't, as a mother now, I just can't imagine the process of getting. But so I'd like to know about the tools in the process. And what we're describing here is being able to have freedom in our minds, right? It's for our minds to be free, because I don't know, there's just something, and it isn't like you can just go from like that kind of like 9/11 or the troubles in Ireland and be like 1 week later, like peace, love. Yeah.
No,
right. To me about
right.
the process and the tools and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, there's also the necessity of grieving.
Yes.
So forgiveness is not designed to interdict grieving.
Mm.
It's designed to let grieving finally end.
Mm.
And grieving is necessary. So, there's a quality called spiritual bypass,
Yes.
where people try to get holy really quickly and make believe that they're not human, and that, this, that, and the other thing. And forgiveness has nothing to do with that.
Mm.
It's a profound understanding that life has suffering, and that there's a part of us that we're all going to suffer. It's just like, do we stay mired in that forever and then create our identity around it? Or do we allow some suffering, grieve it, and then be willing to move on? That's the
Because part of the grieving process is anger, and it's entirely appropriate to be really angry about what happened.
It can save your life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just we can't live there forever.
But if you hold onto it too long, it becomes like battery acid eating through the container.
Yeah.
If I meet someone who has had bad things happen to them and they've never been angry, I wonder what's wrong with them.
Same. I'm like, and I'm also like, what's going to trigger it?
Yeah.
Because it's there.
Yeah. It's going to happen.
You want to be careful. Maybe in the middle of the night, they'll wake up and grab a hatchet. You know what I mean? It's like...
Yeah. So tell me what's in the book. Tell me like what's in there and how it will help people. Like what are some of the strategies?
Well, we start out by saying what forgiveness is and is not. It's not forgive and forget. It's forgive and remember differently. And we have some strategies to help people do that. We have exercises that we start out with grievances. Well, actually, we start out with research in the workbook, and we show how forgiveness has been demonstrated, I think, indisputably to be very good for us. Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Fred's research at Stanford, the research has been corroborated the world over. And then we start breaking things down. We start out with the idea of a grievance, and Fred had mentioned earlier about the state of our country right now, left and right, and conservative and liberal. Fred coined this phrase, I think, and I use it often. We live in a time in which the grievance industrial complex is having a big day, creating grievances. So what are grievances? We try to break it down into small, bite-sized understandings. We do a grievance exercise, like what happened, so somebody cut you off in traffic on the way to work today. That's happened to everyone, right? What happens? He cut me off in traffic. Well, how did you feel about that? Well, I was really pissed off. Then what did you do about that? Well, I caught up with him and I cut him off in traffic. Well, there's a bright idea for you. Or I caught up with him and I flicked him off, And then the following question is, what did you do? Put a check mark beside everything you did in response to what happened that actually changed what happened. Nothing can change what happened. So much of our inability to forgive is trying to relitigate the past, And so what we try to do is we tease that out. So the guy cut you off in traffic, yeah, and your assessment is he's a jerk. Well, that's what all of us would kind of feel, right? And maybe it's true, but we don't know. We don't know. That's our subjective opinion. It could very well be the case that the guy who cut us off in traffic is a pediatric surgeon on his way to the hospital to save a kid's life in emergency surgery. Who's to say? That's the objective part. We don't know. So we have to understand that our assumptions can sometimes get in our way. And by doing that, we are able to disentangle a little bit from the grievance story. And then we look at
one other piece, just to be really simple, is like I've been teaching forgiveness for decades. What Lynden and I did was turn it into a step-by-step, like moment-to-moment workbook where every single question is posed directly. Like I'm a Stanford teacher. I'm all in my head and airy-fairy and stuff. The value of this was we pulled apart like every little component and made an exercise for everything. That was the other thing that this book is a piece of is Lynden has been doing modest amount of research on it. I mean, he doesn't have a laboratory or anything, but he's doing action research with people he's teaching, in recovery. And there's like encouraging, let's say, preliminary data that we can teach a secular method of forgiveness, and it's helpful to people. It reduces their emotional overload. It makes them a little more likely to stick with recovery. It makes them more forgiving. We're just at the beginning of that. For me, the good news is that like Lynden teaches like from the workbook. You start at A, B, C, D. My mind as a Stanford person goes from A to Z in like 4 seconds. And it's really valuable to have some data saying, yeah, this helps people.
Yeah. And we just outlined the steps. There's a section on self-forgiveness. It's really important.
Can you talk about that? Because that's very important. Like I work mostly with women, mostly with middle-aged women, and a lot of them are mothers. And that is very hard for them. And that is a process when they get sober. Can you talk about self-forgiveness?
Well, this is the latest round of teaching trials that I've done has been focused on self-forgiveness. And I've found this to be really a connecting point for people in recovery. There's a component in grievance we call it unenforceable rules. Those shoulds and oughts that we have about life, that this should be this way or ought to be that way. In recovery groups, I hear sometimes that expectations or future resentments waiting to happen, But that's the kind of energy we're going for there. And one of the unenforceable rules, there's simple unenforceable rules. People should not cut me off in traffic. Okay, well, they do. So what do you do when they do? Another one that's so important, and it was important for me personally, and I find it so important for people that I've chatted with in recovery about this, is that the idea that I can't make a mistake is an unenforceable rule.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of making mistakes. It's how we recover from them. How do we acknowledge it? How do we apologize? How do we make amends? How do we make things good, make things right? Not only with the other person, but with ourselves. We have a need to do that for ourselves. Self-forgiveness is such an important, I've discovered such an important conversation with people in recovery, because how do you recover from terrible mistakes that you might have made. One of the examples in our workbook happened not far from where I'm sitting right now. A young woman got totally drunk. I forget what her blood alcohol level was, but it was off the charts. And she was driving at Folly Beach and driving like a maniac and hit a young bride who had just been married.
Oh, I think I read that. I read that story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was in the news. Yeah. And so it killed the bride and it wounded the groom. And so, you know, and I don't know where she is now, but when we wrote the book, she was still in jail.
She's in prison. I think she
She's
got
in prison
like
now. Yeah.
20, 30 years. Yeah.
How in the world can she make sense of her life right now?
Yeah.
And forgive herself? Because here's the key point that Fred makes, and I totally agree with this when it comes to self-forgiveness. It's more important to do good than feel bad. Feeling bad has a very limited shelf life. You can wallow in your misery your whole life if you want to. It's your choice. But if you're doing that, you're not out feeding hungry people. You're not reading books to children. You're not picking up trash off the beach. You're not, we have a choice about how we're going to spend our time and energy. I have discovered that spending it in misery is not very productive.
The 12-step programs, with their emphasis on apology and amends, are a central part of what that, do good, not feel bad. That there's a process. I mean, and this is related somewhat to the, research on apology and stuff like that, that you need to feel remorse from what you've done. And you need to feel a modest amount of guilt. I mean, you need that negative push that something's got to change. But feeling shame or long-term guilt, those are meaningless. They're fake. They don't do anything. They're just placeholders. And people make the ridiculous assumption, well, I felt bad for 2 years, as if that's an accomplishment. But what matters is like real remorse, a sincere apology, a true desire to make amends. Those matter, and those can take some training and help and therapy. But when you've done that, like when you've actually felt legitimately bad for what you did and tried to make it better in whatever way you can forgive yourself. Like feeling bad doesn't contribute anything. It's when you do the appropriate steps to repair, you can let yourself off the hook. It's like, you paid your dues, so to speak. That's the crucial message.
I am, do you know what I'm recalling? I don't know if you remember this. This was some time ago, maybe 15 years ago, that the fashion designer, John Galliano, and he was in, he worked, I can't remember if it was Chanel or Dior, and he was very, very drunk in a bar in Paris and just went on an anti-Semitic tirade that was recorded and, of course, was appalling. And that made the headlines, and he was fired immediately, and he went into rehab and he issued an apology. And then he disappeared for quite some time. And he spent 2 years quietly visiting the Jewish community and going to synagogues and speaking with rabbis and asking for them to educate him about the Jewish experience and anti-Semitism. And, I think, like issuing the formal apology and going to rehab, like, great, glad you're getting help. But that 2 years was really important.
Mm-hmm.
And not publicly. He wasn't photographed going to the synagogue, right? It was quietly done, and it was a process.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that was what he did was an expression of his ugliness of himself. Like it was like, I am so ugly inside. Mm-hmm. I'm going to show you how ugly I am. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, has consequences because it was devastating and hurtful for a lot of people. And I felt that was a very appropriate process that he did.
The most important thing regarding this is to not do it again.
Yes.
Whatever it is you've done, whatever it is you have to forgive yourself for, by far and away, the most important thing that you can offer to somebody you've hurt or to yourself is don't do it again. And everything else is at some level blah 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 till you get there.
How can parents in recovery, do you think, especially early recovery? I just have, I'm just thinking of clients I have who have so much guilt and shame about their drinking around their children. And I'm like, and the best thing you can do is just carry on not drinking. Like that's the best thing you can do, is not drink on how bad you feel about what you did in the past.
That guilt and shame becomes a toxic brew that we call self-attack. And when the self-attack kicks in, it's hard to get out of that spin cycle. We have an exercise we call positive intention. And after you go through the self-attack for a while, the guilt and the shame, we ask the question, so, your marriage ended in divorce. Well, why did you get married? You didn't get married to get a divorce. You got married to build a connection with someone, to build a life together. That was the positive intention. The divorce was a mistake, and everybody makes mistakes. And here's the way we make up for mistakes so that we can chart a path to the future in a positive, constructive way, fulfilling sort of our life's goals and passions. I'm not sure how to intervene in a cycle where the parents are still actively drinking in front, and they feel bad about that with regard to their children. Yeah, I tell them not to drink probably isn't helping a whole lot, but I don't know what else to tell them. It's a real active problem.
No, but if both parents are drinking, that's brutal. But if there's a parent who's a little bit healthier and is not actively drinking, they can provide guidance to the children as to how they handle it, how to hold the example of a parent who has bad self-control and makes bad decisions. It can be interpreted in age-appropriate ways that teach compassion, forgiveness, and accountability. Like, it's not like life stops just because people are behaving in ways that are destructive. There is still the possibility of a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, somebody coming in and providing some clear, age appropriate adult guidance that involves both good heartedness, which is essential, and accountability and consequences. And if the parents can't provide that, which is often true, it would be nice to find someone who can.
Yeah.
What is your hope for this book? Who do you want it to reach?
Well, we hope that folks who are struggling with recovery issues will find in it a huge support. We hope family members of people in recovery will find huge support, because the exercises, although the intervention is directed to a person in recovery, it's the same exercises that would apply to anything, really. This is a forgiveness book targeted for recovery, but it can be used for a wide variety of groups and communities. But, I know that there's an enormous amount of people who are struggling with sobriety in this country. And if we are able to help even a small percentage of those people, we'll feel like we've done a good job.
Fred, you've done this work for 40 plus years. What are your takeaways about human nature and forgiveness? You must have come to a few kind of really interesting insight.
I can tell you that you're not always welcomed when you come in and say, hey, I want to help you forgive. People love their grievances and they love their wounds, and they have a lot of resistance around people coming in and saying, you might be better off without constantly referring to your ex as an asshole. That might help you. I'm going to say, for me, after all these years, this workbook is, and Lyndon and I collaborated on this, about as simple and clear and direct a way as I have seen for us to consider this a tiny little contribution for world peace. Like that there's just hopefully will be a little less bitterness, anger, hostility running around. That's good for everybody.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that all of the problems in the world can be boiled down to resentment.
Yeah. A lot of them. A
Yeah.
lot of them.
Yeah.
I
Other
know.
people are not doing what I want them to do. From the guy cutting me up in the traffic to
Yeah.
all the people in the country next to me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
To the red state and the blue state, right? They're not,
Yeah.
they don't behave the way that I think people should behave.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Resentments are so seductive. So seductive.
There's a beautiful poem by Yehuda Amichai, who was the poet laureate of Israel. He died in the year 2000, but the poem is entitled "The Place Where We Are Right," and I don't remember it all, but I'm going to give you the gist of it. He says that from the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the springtime. That place is hard and trampled like a yard. The place where we are right, there's no room for a conversation. And that's the struggle we have when resentments and grievances run free without any accountability.
The one other thing that I could say as a longtime therapist, drugs, alcohol, overeating, or whatever the addiction is, sex, or even just being right can be an addiction. They're attempted solutions to life's problems. Like, alcohol does dull pain, and it does, and even anger is an attempted solution because it does increase your dopamine for a moment, so you feel better. But the problem is the solutions then become the problem. And that's where it just becomes intractable. That's one of the reasons why this is such a fertile area, is people have attempted solutions to the problem of life or of mistreatment or failure, whatever it is. And their solutions may be the temporary dopamine experience, but then that solution becomes an even bigger problem. And they can't get to the actual problems as long as this bigger solution problem is in the way. And it just seems like such fertile ground to try to offer a little bit of help in it.
That is a beautiful place to. Sorry, Lyndon, did you want to add something?
No, I'm just agreeing with him.
That was a beautiful place to end this. I found this conversation fascinating. I just want everyone to know that the book is called the Forgive for Good Recovery Workbook, and it will be added to my essential reading list that I give to clients, because I love your work. It's very aligned with what I teach. It's completely, it's about, resentments are the free drunk. They are poison in your mind. There is a process to free yourself. And this is because the people you're resentful at, they're fine. They're getting on with their day.
Right.
It's you're the one who's not okay. And we want to get to a place where you're okay. It's who's right or wrong. It's not about justice. It's about you being okay. And that's what we need to understand. And I think this book is going to help a lot of people. So
we sure hope so. Yes, we think so too.
So thank you guys for joining me. This has been a wonderful conversation. Yeah.
Lovely.
And thank you so much for everybody for listening to the Soberful podcast. I highly recommend that you check out this book. I will be diving into it, I'm sure, for a lot of the work that I have with my clients coming up. So thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I dreamt that you were twisting through 7 suns of gold, and the gypsy was insisting